Jeffrey Lockwood spent youthful afternoons darkly enchanted by feeding grasshoppers to black widow spiders in his New Mexican backyard, which accounts for his scientific and literary affinities. He earned a doctorate in entomology and worked as an ecologist at the University of Wyoming before metamorphosing. Boy, he really loaded this with some. Then he was professor of natural sciences and humanities in the Department of Philosophy and Creative Writing. He considers Sherlock Holmes a model of scientific prowess, integrating exquisite observational skills with incisive, abductive, not deductive reasoning. As such, the scientific researcher is oddly preadapted to loving and writing literary mystery. We are glad to have you, Jeff Lockwood.
So, got a little bit so you're not looking at my nostrils. I'm happy to be here. I think on a per capita basis, Wyoming has the highest attendance tonight. 15% of our members are here. How about Colorado, huh? I'd like to begin this evening with just a short 3-minute clip from the 1939 film Hound of the Baskervilles, starring Basil Rathbone as Sherlock Holmes and Nigel Bruce as Dr. Watson. So let me pull that up here, and I think we can see if this works. And we'll go. Here we are.
Blessed if I know why on earth you want all these clippings about this Baskerville fellow.
I've an idea, Watson, that young Sir Henry isn't destined for a very long existence in this world.
What?
My conjecture is that he'll be murdered.
Murdered?
It'll be very interesting to see if my deductions are accurate.
Oh, Mr. Holmes, while you were out, a gentleman called to see if you left this.
He asked you to give it to me?
Oh, no, sir. He just left it by mistake, I imagine.
Uh-huh. Dr. Mortimer?
He didn't leave his name, sir.
No, it's here on the stick, Mrs. Hudson.
Oh, is it? I didn't notice.
Do you know any Dr. Mortimer, Watson?
Huh? What did he want?
He didn't say, sir.
What do you make of it, Watson?
Why should I make anything of it? The fellow came to see you.
Ah, but what kind of a fellow? Let me hear you reconstruct him from his walking stick by our usual method of elementary observation.
Well, I should say that Dr. Mortimer is a successful man, well esteemed.
Good. Excellent.
I should say that he does a great deal of his visiting on foot, because the iron ferrule is worn down.
Perfectly sound.
Let's have a look at this inscription. From his friends of the CCH. CCH. I should say that's the something or other hunt.
Really, Watson, you've excelled yourself.
Has anything escaped me?
Almost everything, my dear fellow.
Huh?
A present to a doctor, I'd say, is more likely to come from a hospital than a hunt. And when the letters CC are placed before the hospital, the name Charing Cross Hospital rather obviously presents itself.
Oh, you may be right.
Furthermore, I'd say that Dr. Mortimer had a small practice in the country and was the owner of a dog.
How can you tell that?
Quite simple. From the teeth marks. Look, you can see for yourself. A rather large dog, I'd say. And unless I'm mistaken, Dr. Mortimer will call on us again in a few moments.
Rubbish, Holmes. Rubbish. How the devil can you deduce that?
Well, as he left his stick, isn't it reasonable to presume that he'll come back and get it?
Dr. Mortimer, sir.
Mr. Holmes,
Yes. Come in, Dr. Mortimer.
I took the liberty of calling upon
And
you.
left your stick.
Oh, so I did. Thank you so much.
A presentation, I see.
Yes, sir, from Charing Cross Hospital.
Watson.
Of course.
How do you do, sir?
Mr. Holmes, you're the one man in all England who can help me.
Well, won't you sit down?
Thank you. A friend of mine is in grave danger.
May I inquire his name?
Sir Henry Baskerville, heir to the estate of Baskerville Hall.
So now, I'd like to share with you an abridged passage from A Study in Scarlet, which is the opening story of the Sherlock Holmes series by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. The narrator is Dr. Watson, who has just recently become the great detective's flatmate. I will spare you my pathetic attempts at British accents and just read you the dialogue. I rose somewhat earlier than usual and found that Sherlock Holmes had not yet finished his breakfast. I picked up a magazine from the table and attempted to while away the time with it, while my companion munched silently at his toast. One of the articles had a pencil mark at the heading, and I naturally began to run my eye through it. It attempted to show how much an observant man might learn by an accurate and systematic examination of all that came his way. It struck me as being a remarkable mixture of shrewdness and of absurdity. "What ineffable twaddle!" I cried, slapping the magazine down on the table. "I've never read such rubbish in my life." "What is it?" asked Sherlock Holmes. "Why, this article," I said, pointing at it with my egg spoon as I sat down to my breakfast. "It is not practical. I should like to see him clapped down in a third-class carriage on the Underground and asked to give the trades of all his fellow travelers. I would lay 1,000 to 1 against him." "You would lose your money," Sherlock Holmes remarked calmly. "As for the article, I wrote it myself." "You?" "Yes, I have a turn both for observation and for deduction. The theories which I have expressed there, and which appear to you to be so chimerical, are really extremely practical. So practical that I depend upon them for my bread and cheese." "And how?" I asked involuntarily. "Well, I have a trade of my own. I suppose I'm the only one in the world. I'm a consulting detective. Those rules of deduction laid down in that article, which aroused your scorn, are invaluable to me. You appeared to be surprised when I told you on our first meeting that you had come from Afghanistan. You were told, no doubt." "Nothing of the sort. I knew you came from Afghanistan. From long habit, the train of thoughts ran so quickly through my mind that I arrived at the conclusion without being conscious of any intermediate steps. There were such steps, however. The train of reasoning ran. Here is a gentleman of a medical type, but with the air of a military man, clearly an army doctor then. He has just come from the tropics, for his face is dark, and that is not the natural tint of his skin, for his wrists are fair. He has undergone hardship and sickness, as his haggard face says clearly. His left arm has been injured. He holds it in a stiff and unnatural manner. Where in the tropics could an English army doctor have seen much hardship and got his arm wounded? Clearly it is in Afghanistan. The whole train of thought did not occupy a second. I then remarked that you came from Afghanistan, and you were astonished." "It's simple enough as you explain it," I said, smiling. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle published the first Sherlock Holmes story in 1887. Holmes was instantly popular and went on to appear as the main character in 56 short stories and 4 novellas over the next 40 years, almost all of which were narrated by Holmes' roommate, assistant and friend, Dr. Watson. Each of the stories involves a mystery, but perhaps the biggest mystery is one that the master sleuth will never get to solve. Why? Why is Sherlock Holmes still alive in the minds of readers 133 years after he graced the pages of the Strand Magazine? Why do these stories continue to resonate with today's readers, not to mention television viewers and moviegoers? And for our purposes this evening, what can we, as contemporary mystery writers, learn about our own literary ventures from an analysis of the success of Conan Doyle's stories? I suspect that at least many of the qualities that captivated readers a century ago and that continue to enchant readers today might well work for us. After all, what writer among us wouldn't want to be as popular as Conan Doyle was in his time while crafting characters and plots that would still captivate readers in the year 2155? I now count myself among those who are enchanted by these stories. A Holmesian in British terms, a Sherlockian in American terms, having read the entire canon twice, some stories 3 times, some more, and even waded into writing my own essays and pastiches involving the master detective, I thought it might be interesting to ponder my motives and perhaps infer those of my fellow readers. So allow me to borrow this passage, which begins with the voice of a promising detective from Scotland Yard, who comes to Holmes for assistance. He says, "So far as I can see, it is just as tangled a business as ever I handled, and yet, at first it seemed so simple that one couldn't go wrong. There's no motive, Mr. Holmes. That's what bothers me. Can't put my hand on a motive. Here's a dead man, there's no denying that. But so far as I can see, no reason on earth why anyone should wish him harm." Holmes lit his cigar and leaned back in his chair. "Let's hear about it," said he. And so, lean back, light a cigar, at least figuratively, and sip your brandy. I brought some to share with you this evening. And come along on my investigation. Let's see if I can crack the case of Holmes' enduring popularity and garner some clues as to how our mystery writing might approximate his public esteem. So I'm actually going to suggest that we no cigars, but we do have brandy. So and that a slightly lubricated audience is Oftentimes, the simplest theory is the best place to start. So let's begin with the observation that the Sherlock Holmes tales are good stories well told. When talking about his Sherlockian novel, The House of Silk, Anthony Horowitz explained that as a youth, he'd been captivated by the whole package that Doyle had created and wrapped in the atmosphere of 19th century London. He said, it's the fog, the cobblestones, the fire flickering, the river Thames, the sound of the Stradivarius, the strange villains. So let's begin with the obvious plots. Consider first Conan Doyle's plots, the backbone of a mystery. A typical story begins in the flat at 221B Baker Street, with Holmes and Watson reading or conversing quietly, until in comes a man or a woman with a problem. Not just any problem, but one that is unusual, difficult, urgent, intriguing, and sufficiently perplexing to pique the curiosity of Sherlock Holmes. And from there, the game is afoot, which is to say, we launch headlong into inquiries and inspections, interviews and journeys across London and all of England. The case could be murder, or theft, a swindle, a missing person, or a mistaken identity. But what matters is that we get to see the investigation through the eyes of Dr. Watson, in whose shoes we can readily imagine ourselves. And in fact, Doyle created the forensic crime drama, which is one of television's most popular and lucrative genres, including today's CSI and NCIS series. And next, consider the setting of the Holmes stories. London, at the end of the Victorian era into Edwardian times. As a British bibliophilic blogger put it, and I quote, "As far as popular entertainment goes, we modern folk have rather 19th century taste. Our love of vampires can be traced to the vision of Bram Stoker. Our Christmas traditions are heavily indebted to the stories of Charles Dickens. Sherlock Holmes, kept alive by a menagerie of TV shows, films, memorabilia, and readers, is no different." Well, so then I ask, why are these simpler times so mesmerizing to the contemporary reader? Anthony Horowitz offers the following. It's the last gasp of English history before technology takes over. It really is the last glimmer of an entire age before it comes to modern times just around the corner. Maybe that's why we want to cling to it and remember it, he writes. I think that in our technocentric world, we are reassured that someone without gizmos and gadgets can solve difficult problems with little more than a keen eye, simple instruments, and a brilliant mind. What's more, Doyle paints the most vivid pictures of city scenes and countryside views. Here's a passage weaving together time and place. In the third week of November in the year 1895, a dense yellow fog settled down upon London. From the Monday to the Thursday, I doubt whether it was ever possible from our windows in Baker Street to see the loom of the opposite houses. After pushing back our chairs from breakfast, we saw the greasy, heavy, brown swirl still drifting past us and condensing in oily droplets upon the window panes. My comrades in patient and active nature could endure this drab existence no longer. And now we come to the characters. Primarily Holmes and Watson, although their housekeeper, Mrs. Hudson, their nemesis, Professor Moriarty, and Scotland Yard Detective Lestrade, among others, are created in marvelously evocative detail. Sherlock Holmes is, of course, a master of inference and observation, living within a rational, analytic world of his own creation that has little room for human sensitivities. He is a flawed hero, capable of kindness but rarely empathy. Scott diagnosed various conditions, this is the cottage industry, including bipolar disorder and Asperger's syndrome, a form of autism. One suspects that his use of cocaine was a kind of self-medication during bouts of depression. Holmes can be gracious when necessary, but when he is deep in an investigation, decorum disappears and he becomes tactless. His social ineptitude endears him to sympathetic readers. This lovable geek is the prototype for television characters such as Columbo, Adrian Monk, and even Dr. House of medical fame. And let's not forget Dr. Watson, an affable man, a forbearing friend, and a skilled physician, who is brave and loyal when it comes to collaborating with his trying companion. There is good reason for Holmes reassuring clients that Watson is indispensable and discreet. I should say something about the nature of the stories before turning to my deeper analysis of the immortality of Sherlock Holmes, who did not die along with Professor Moriarty at Reichenbach Falls. It is easy to overlook the obvious. The canon is readable. The 60 stories comprise about 1,800 pages, meaning that one can read the entirety in about 40 hours. Doyle wrote for the emerging middle class, the people whose taste would be denigrated by snooty critics as populist in the century to come. Holmes fans were the sort who were priced out of concerts, the ones who waited for the cheap versions of popular novels. Historian David Payne describes them as, quote, the non-intellectual, non-public school, hard-working people, the first true mass moderns. And the Strand targeted them with exciting, high-concept genre stories, mysteries and science fiction, from writers such as H.G. Wells, Jules Verne, and of course, Arthur Conan Doyle. Perhaps this quality of the aspiring everyman subliminally resonates with our sense that we too are not members of the upper crust. In sum, we have a really good book that launches an energetic plot unfolding in vividly described settings that lack gizmo and techno-cleverness, with an intriguingly and deeply flawed hero, along with his loyal friend, who seems much like us, all embedded in a story of literary quality that lacks pretense and connects with us 99%ers. I turn now to a set of 4 values or themes that are implicit in the Sherlock Holmes stories, and which might go a long way, jumped ahead, okay, might go a long way to explaining their timeliness and his immortality. And perhaps they'll go some distance in helping us consider what could make our writing more successful. Oh, if that's even possible. Now we're good. First is the nature of friendship. Of course, there were literary bromances before Holmes and Watson. For example, we have Achilles and Patroclus in Homer's Iliad, Hamlet and Horatio from Shakespeare's Hamlet, Don Quixote and Sancho Panza from Miguel de Cervantes' tales, Darcy and Bingley from Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, Pitt and Herbert from Charles Dickens' Great Expectations. But I think I propose, with some trepidation, that none of these manly friendships were as absolutely vital to the stories as that of Holmes and Watson. I would even suggest one can read Doyle's stories as delving into the mysteries of philia, brotherly love, the bond between friends who argue and annoy one another but whose loyalty is abiding and assured. The friendship between Holmes and Watson has the ring of truth insofar as they are both able to set aside their differences in disposition and temperament. Watson must often search for the human core beneath Sherlock's logical thinking and laconic emotions. And Sherlock must accept Watson's own bourgeois concerns, like those of wife and family, which are rather absurd to him. Yet these obstacles and conflicts elevate rather than detract from their relationship. Critics who describe Holmes as distant and self-absorbed overlook my favorite passage when Watson has been shot. "You're not hurt, Watson, for God's sake, say you're not hurt." It was worth a wound. It was worth many wounds to know the depth and loyalty and love which lay behind that cold mask. The clear, hard eyes were dimmed for a moment, and the firm lips were shaking. For the one and only time I caught a glimpse of a great heart as well as a great brain. All my years of humble but single-minded service culminated in that moment of revelation. Next is the value I'll call integrity, which is a combination of autonomy, authenticity, and self-determination. Holmes exemplifies a kind of personal freedom through his willingness to be himself without apology and to live with whatever comes as a result. As for his sense of justice, he says, "I had rather play tricks with the law of England than with my own conscience." Now then, with regard to his personal interactions, it's not that he's unaware of what others are feeling when he's focused on an investigation, diagnosis of autism spectrum notwithstanding. Rather, he doesn't care. Or at least he doesn't care unless offending others impedes his search for clues. In fact, he exhibits considerable grace when the case demands, as when interacting with men of power and women of influence. But Holmes is equally, I would say, more comfortable among the working class, charming shopkeepers, gardeners, maids, and butlers. Although Holmes delights in one-upping the detectives of Scotland Yard, he's happy to allow the police to take credit for having solved crimes when in fact the solution is largely, if not entirely, his own. But Holmes has no interest in fame, other than the admiration of Watson, who describes his companion as a man who, quote, disdains popular notoriety, but is moved to his depths by spontaneous wonder and praise from a friend. Holmes is something of a rebel, and this quality appealed to American readers of the time and still today. Indeed, Holmes seems to admire America's rejection of social strata and to relish the capacity of making one's name and fortune without the privilege of class. Perhaps this passage captures much of the complex, flawed, and genuine personage of Sherlock Holmes and the bourgeois nature of Dr. Watson. Watson writes, "I had seen little of Holmes lately. My marriage had drifted us away from each other. My own complete happiness and the home-centered interests which rise up around the man who first finds himself master of his own establishment were sufficient to absorb all my attention, while Holmes, who loathed every form of society with his whole bohemian soul, remained in our lodgings in Baker Street, buried among his old books and alternating from week to week between cocaine and ambition, the drowsiness of the drug and the fierce energy of his own keen nature." I turn now to Holmes's mind and his cultivation of the intellect. Holmes is a savant, a genius at logical inference from objectively obtained evidence. His is the mind of a scientist who admonishes Watson that it is a capital mistake to theorize in advance of the facts. Perhaps in this age of relativism, a time in which expertise is taken to be very nearly a character flaw, and a world in which what one feels is veridical rather than what one can rationally argue, there is a particular pull for the qualities of Sherlock Holmes, and he makes no apology for his mental prowess. "My dear Watson," said he, "I cannot agree with those who rank modesty among the virtues. To the logician, all things should be seen exactly as they are, and to underestimate oneself is as much a departure from truth as to exaggerate one's own powers." But I should hasten to note that Holmes' intellectual interests extend far beyond the solving of crimes. He might be almost superhumanly focused when working on a case, indeed to the point of not eating or sleeping for days. But at other times, we find him studying the music of the Middle Ages, or writing a monograph on the polyphonic motets of Lassus. Holmes is an accomplished violinist and a lover of classical music, particularly German works, with rather less interest in the French or Italian composers. In short, Holmes is an exceptionally smart man in a time and place in which intelligence was respectable, admirable, and even celebrated. I would like to finish my analysis of our abiding fascination with Sherlock Holmes with a simple observation that all of the previous speculation and analysis might have overlooked, and that is, the stories are delightful. The actor who plays Holmes' brother Mycroft in the television program Sherlock puts it nicely. He says, "Over years and years of accumulating various versions and Victoriana, people have slightly lost sight of the fact that they're enormous fun. They're quick reads, they're jolly thrilling, blood-curdling, thrilling adventures. And contrary to some claims, good stories, I would say, even good literature, need not be dark, brooding, lugubrious, or dystopian. For example, I think it's not all that difficult to write the bleak and cynical tales of Cormac McCarthy, which is not to say that every story of Sherlock Holmes has a happy ending. Much of the joy that comes with delving into the Holmesian world arises from the peculiarity of those who engage the stories with a passion that transforms literary fiction into imaginative reality. In this netherworld, people suspend their disbelief and delve into the stories as accounts of real people living real lives in real times and places. There are wonderfully intense and profoundly good-humored arguments swirling around at least three elements. First, there are the trifles. As in Holmes' assertion that my method is founded upon the observation of trifles. And in this regard, everything is fair game, everything, and the more trifling, the better. There are journal articles on virtually every imaginable person, practice, and place in the canon. I've relished podcasts about board games, beards, boxing, brands, billiards, boarding houses, and bohemians. And I've written an essay myself about insects in the canon, as a reprise of a 1947 article on that trifling subject. Second, there are the chronologies, which are perhaps the most fiercely debated analyses. Exactly when did each story take place? Researchers of the Holmesian timeline use every bit of evidence to make their case, from dates of flower blooming to the arrival of famous persons to the timing of world events to wild speculation. Consider Holmes' birthday. Most chronologists agree that it was in 1854 based on a cryptic allusion in a single passage, but some stick with 1853. And January 6th has become the date because a famed lover of these stories noted that Holmes twice referred to Shakespeare's Twelfth Night. And from this inferred that the detective's interest in this play surely came from his correspondence with his own birthday. Okay. Next, there are the radical theorists who take special joy in creating controversy through outrageous claims supported by intriguing, if cherry-picked, evidence from the stories. For example, there are assertions that Watson was a woman, Holmes was an American. Although it's not entirely clear which of these is more unsettling to those who take such pleasure in melding fiction and reality. And finally, the imaginative possibilities of there having been a Holmes and a Watson seems to slide inevitably into the realm of the pastiche, the writing of new stories. The hardcore Holmesians insist that these new stories be set in London between 1880 and 1915, but the more playful types bring the characters into the present, maintaining their enchanting personalities, but presenting them with contemporary cases. I publish both, and they provide very different sources of pleasure as a writer. What this means for us as mystery writers is that our stories must ultimately provide pleasure for the reader. We must take people on ingenious journeys such as they engage in the willing suspension of disbelief, and the line between their real lives and our fictional characters becomes blurred. How delightful it is to imagine myself in conversation with Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes, or Raymond Chandler's Philip Marlowe, or Lawrence Block's Bernie Rodenbach, or Robert Parker's Spencer, and who can tell me where Spencer grew up? In Laramie, Wyoming. Robert Parker Spencer grew up in No. I'm going to conclude this evening with an abridged version of an article that appeared in a recent Sherlock Holmes journal, the publication of the Sherlock Holmes Society of London. The article combines scholarly and playful analysis with an element of modern-day pastiche. I wrote this piece in collaboration with Dr. Franz Peter Griesmeyer, a colleague in philosophy who's taught logic at introductory and advanced levels for many years. Mystery readers with a philosophical bent have argued that Sherlock Holmes engaged in deduction. A Google search of Sherlock Holmes plus deductive reasoning generated 87,000 hits. Sherlock Holmes and induction, just 24,000 hits. Sherlock Holmes and abduction, only 8,000 hits. To investigate this intriguing case, we should begin by understanding the nature of the suspects. What are these forms of reasoning, and how can mystery writers know which term to use, even if you decide to stick with deduction for all types of logical inference, just like you might use pistol when you mean revolver or bullet when you mean cartridge. Simply put, deduction makes information that is implicit within the premises explicit in the conclusion. Nothing new is extracted through this form of inference. A deduction can be valid, in which case the conclusion necessarily follows from the premises via the principles of logic. For example, all criminals have squinty eyes. Charles Manson was a criminal, therefore Charles Manson had squinty eyes. This deduction is logically valid, but the conclusion is false. Manson appears to be frighteningly, maniacally wide-eyed in many ways. The falsity results from one of the premises being false. That is, not all criminals have squinty eyes. As such, the reasoning is not sound. It is valid, but not sound. In a sound deduction, the reasoning is both valid and the premises are true. For example, all gangsters are criminals. Al Capone was a gangster, therefore Al Capone was a criminal. But one must be careful, because it's possible to deduce a true conclusion from false premises. Very tricky. For example, all men named Watson are doctors. That's false. Holmes' friend is named Watson. That's true. Therefore, Holmes' friend is a doctor. And that's true. Okay, so you can get a true conclusion even with a false premise. The popular characterization of deduction is that this form of reasoning moves from general premises to particular conclusion. And this is possible, as with the aforementioned cases. All criminals have squinty eyes is a general premise which leads to the specific conclusion that Charles Manson had squinty eyes. However, deduction can also go from particular premises to particular conclusions. One could say Arthur Conan Doyle was a British writer and a medical doctor. Therefore, he was a medical doctor. So there's no necessity that deduction becomes narrower in its conclusions. Turning now to induction. This form of inference amplifies observation, leading to conclusions about what has not yet been seen but is merely likely. For example, a detective who has tracked down many female serial killers and found that every one of them knew their victims might reasonably surmise that all such murderers kill acquaintances. However, it is possible that a female serial killer might target strangers. Actually, about 14% do so. Likewise, a police officer who has had many adverse encounters with young men of a particular race might infer that most, even all, such individuals are dangerous. Racial profiling is a form of induction, and it's not difficult to see the hazard of this form of reasoning. As with deduction, there is a popular but mistaken characterization of induction. This form of reasoning is said to extrapolate from particular observations to general conclusions, but this needn't be the case. For example, suppose a seasoned detective arrives at the house of a missing child. Based on having handled 200 such cases in her career, none of which involved a kidnapping, the investigator infers that the missing child was not abducted. So she rationally directs her officers not to devote their energy to pursuing the possibility of a kidnapping. In this case, induction moves from the general to the particular. We might note that kidnapping, however unlikely, is possible. About 0.3% of all missing children are kidnapped. So out of 200 cases, it would be statistically plausible that none that she had seen involved abduction. To summarize, induction is a form of reasoning that moves from the seen to the unseen, which could be an inference from a few observations to a general conclusion, or from many observations to a particular expectation. And this brings us to abduction. As with induction, abductive reasoning goes beyond the evidence to amplify what is known, so that its results are highly probable at best. But while inductive inferences extrapolate observed patterns into the yet unobserved future, abduction postulates unobserved, sometimes even unobservable entities, for example, an undetectable poison or the decay of a corpse, in order to explain observed events. That is, to explain the death of a person in the case of poisoning and the stench coming from behind a locked door in the case of the body. This educated hypothesizing is why abduction is sometimes called inference to the best explanation. For example, a detective finds a body lying in an alley and notes that there is a knife protruding from the chest. Based on experience, the investigator makes the rational inference that the individual was murdered. Although this is the best explanation of the evidence, it is uncertain. After all, it's possible that the victim committed suicide. We can imagine that the victim had a terminal disease and decided to frame a hated business partner by staging a murder in the alley behind the tavern that the partner frequented. It's the basis of a good plot, actually. So what about Sherlock Holmes? In The Hound of the Baskervilles, this exchange typifies the detective's reasoning. We are coming now rather to the region of guesswork, said Dr. Mortimer, to which Holmes replies. Say rather, into the region where we balance probabilities and choose most likely. It is the scientific use of the imagination, but we have always some material basis on which to start our speculation. Now, you would call it a guess, no doubt, but I am almost certain that this address has been written in a hotel. If combining a rich set of observations with rigorous critical reasoning to explain events is a decent description of what Sherlock Holmes does, why did Arthur Conan Doyle not have his character refer to this process as abduction? And the answer is simple. The term was coined by the American philosopher Charles Sanders Peirce in his writings on the logic of science in the 1880s. So abduction was entering the scholarly literature in the United States at the same time that Sherlock Holmes stories were entering the mystery literature in England. In short, Conan Doyle would not have been aware of this newly minted term as the most appropriate description for his detective logical inferences. As for using induction, this would have been the appropriate term circa 1900 and would have described Holmes's reasoning much better than deduction. The term had been in wide use among logicians for several hundred years before Conan Doyle was writing his stories. So what might explain this erroneous choice of terminology? First, one might suspect that deduction was more commonly used to refer to logical reasoning of any sort in common parlance. In fact, a Google Books Ngram analysis of British English shows that deductive reasoning was about twice as prevalent as inductive reasoning throughout most of the late 1800s and into the early 1900s. Next, one could contend that the verb forms made for much more fluent writing. For example, from the evidence, Holmes deduced that sounds much better than from the evidence, Holmes induced that. And finally, it is possible that Conan Doyle might not have understood the technical meaning of deduction or the nuanced differences with induction. As for inductive inference, we might favor the latter explanation, given that few people today fathom the distinction among the forms of reasoning. With all of this explication in mind, let's consider the types of reasoning used in a very short story of the Holmesian sort. So I offer you the adventure of the abduction. You can read along with me here. Consulting detective Sherlock Holmes was called out to the posh home of Mrs. Ragdoll in Chelsea. The widowed socialite's cat had gone missing. Upon Holmes' arrival, the distraught owner cheerfully reported, "The notorious pet purloiner has kidnapped Tiger." "What makes you think so?" asked Holmes, suspecting that her client was using sloppy abduction to explain the animal's absence. Inference to the best explanation. "This morning I left Tiger a bowl of kibbles rather than tinned food. You see, at his annual checkup yesterday, the vet put him on a diet. But I digress. The point is that after feeding him, I locked the door and went shopping. When I came back in the afternoon, he was gone. I am certain that Tiger was not kidnapped," said Holmes. "How can you be so sure?" asked Mrs. Ragdoll. "A simple deduction. By definition, kidnapping involves abducting a person. Tiger is not a person, therefore Tiger could not have been kidnapped." "Call it what you will," said Mrs. Ragdoll, scowling at the logical technicality. "He took my cat." "Why do you say he? The police don't have any suspects as far as I know." "My dear, only a man would be callous enough to take an old woman's cat, and someone took my cat." "So it must be a man," said Holmes. Her deductive reasoning is valid, but not sound, thought Holmes, knowing that women were quite capable of heinous acts. But the detective kept this analysis to herself rather than further annoying her client, and continued with her own line of reasoning. "Based on the evidence, by induction, I can infer that Tiger was not taken by the pet purloiner." "Are you certain?" "This criminal has taken 5 other pets from your neighborhood in recent weeks. All were dogs, and in every case, a note demanding money for their return was pinned to the front door. You own a cat," he said nothing of a note. "Of course, I can't be certain, as the pet purloiner could have changed his modus operandi, but I highly doubt it." "Maybe Tiger slipped out the front door when I was leaving," Mrs. Ragdoll said. "That is logically and physically possible, but it has been bucketing down all day, and I've never seen a cat that likes getting soaked. So by induction, I very much doubt that Tiger dashed outside given the weather. However, Tiger could be an exception to this generalization about domestic feelings. Oh goodness, if he stayed inside and didn't come to greet me when I returned, then he must be dead." Mrs. Ragdoll reasoned through a hasty abduction. "The vet said that weighing nearly 2 stone was bad for his health." As she began to solve, Holmes inspected the house and returned to her weepy client after a few minutes. "Tut, tut," Holmes said soothingly. "By careful abduction, I would infer that Tiger is not dead." Mrs. Ragdoll dabbed at her eyes as the detective continued. "I found a wet spot in his litter tray and a fresh hairball on your duvet. These are best explained by his being alive." She gently patted her client's arm while thinking to herself that it was remotely possible that Tiger had both had a wee and coughed up a soggy wad just before Mrs. Ragdoll returned and then died somewhere in the house. "Dear me," sniffled Tiger's owner. "If he's alive, then why didn't he greet me as always?" Indeed, thought Holmes. This is a sensible inductive expectation based on years of experience with the flabby feline. But the detective had plenty of experience with stray cats and mangy kittens when she was growing up in the gritty borough of Suffolk. She knew exactly how to solve this case. Holmes smiled, walked into the kitchen and pressed the electric tin opener. From somewhere in the house, Tiger waddled into the kitchen. Through induction, I inferred that Tiger was like every cat I've known, preferring tinned meals and expressing dissatisfaction through disdain of those he holds accountable. I should have known, said Mrs. Ragdoll as Tiger yowled, having found that induction can also yield mistaken conclusions. Sometimes the sound of a can opener does not portend moist food. Using abduction, I reasoned that Tiger's absence was best explained by his withholding affection as payback for your switching him to kill. As Tiger rubbed furiously and futilely against Mrs. Ragdoll's leg in hope of eliciting tinned food, the detective asked, "And now, might we have a spot of tea?" "If it's after 2, then it's time for tea," said Mrs. Ragdoll. "It's 2:30, said Holmes. "Then it is time for tea." Mrs. Ragdoll soundly deduced. Well, thank you for your attention and forbearance of a lecture on logic. You don't have to use abduction, deduction, induction technically in your writing, but it's kind of nice to know what these things are and how they differ. I know we often, what was it, last month we had a great discussion of all the details that you have to get right with police investigations. And now here's one more detail to add to your sack of details to pay attention to. So if anyone had any comments or questions, I'm happy to try to answer them. Yeah.
So Sherlock actually did do some entomological deduction then?
Insects appear only occasionally, and he doesn't use it. It's very disappointing.
Yeah, I figured it would be.
It's very disappointing. Actually, he's disappointed, and Watson is even more disappointing because forensic entomology was in its infancy at that time, but there are several cases where there are bodies associated with flies, and Watson does not take advantage of the opportunity to estimate the time of death. So it's a little heartbreaking for an entomologist. I think it's Conan Doyle's fault. He was an ophthalmologist, right? And so he probably didn't know squat about forensic entomology. But, no, the insects appear in various places, and they do play a role a couple times. There's one story in which a body is moved out of concern that the flies will begin to lay their eggs and give away its location. So there's a lot more there that could be done.
Yeah. It seems like The Hound of the Baskervilles is his most popular story. Would that be correct?
I would guess so. That seems, I don't know, there's probably some measure of popularity. It would not surprise me if that's the most popular.
Is that because of the film, you think? Or do you know?
That's a good question. I think it has to do with the film. It's got, there is in some ways, if you think about films, one of the things you want is action. That one's got a lot of action, and of course the Moors are in there, and so there's lots of opportunity for creepiness and whatnot. And, giant throat-ripping dogs. There's much, it's got that quality that, a poisoning or, your run-of-the-mill murder doesn't have. So I think that has a lot to do with it.
What do traditional Sherlock Holmesians think of Lucy Liu as Sherlock?
Yeah, that's, right. Right. The conventionalists are probably deeply offended. But, it's kind of funny, because when I wrote a pastiche of a Holmesian-like character, and the former editor of Sherlock Holmes Mystery Magazine said, "It's not a pastiche." No, he said, "No, pastiche must be written at the same time as," and I thought, well, that's not actually the definition of a pastiche. The definition of a pastiche is an imitative work that celebrates blah, blah, blah. So, it turns out that arguing fine points with editors is not no. So I just say thank you for that that.
Did you induce or deduce or abduce that?
Let's see, I guess it was an induction based on many experiences with editors who don't like being told that they're mistaken. And I assumed that this would be one more editor who did not like to be told that he was mistaken. Yeah, okay. He may have been the exception. He may have embraced warmly a short email lecture, but I thought probably not. Yeah.
As someone who fully experienced the 80s, I found it interesting, the comment in there that whoever said it sort of regarded cocaine as a soporific, which is not true. It's a stimulant. And I first of all, I mean, I guess that's one of those things that you can do a gotcha on. But the other thing that was very popular at the time was Mariani wine, which was an opiate, which would be a soporific. So.
Yeah, it's interesting because Holmes has contacted with opium dens, and so it's not as if, right, opium dens were not well known and don't appear, at, numerous places. Let's see, I don't know enough of the pharmacology. He took it at a low dose as an injectable. I don't know that had, and of course, perhaps it's a little bit like alcohol, right, which is a sedative above a certain age and a stimulant below a certain age. So maybe, I don't know, we should have to do a bunch of experiments with, that's a great idea. Wait a minute, we can write a small grant.
Yeah, somehow I wasn't taking notes.
In modern medicine, stimulants can be used to treat attention deficit and hyperactivity disorders.
Yes.
That's right.
So maybe this is something that Conan Doyle observed. Some people responded differently to stimulants than others.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah.
I don't know that that's come up in the literature. Yeah, exactly. So amphetamines are actually weirdly, right, are used for kids with ADHD. Now, I don't know if adults with ADHD respond to, but that would, right, if he gets, that would be evidence that in fact one of Holmes, and of course, his other behaviors, right, this fixating, right, this attention to detail, this kind of narrow-minded focus, all of that would also be consistent with some features of ADHD.
Yeah.
So, and then the cocaine would
What goes it, sir?
I'm gonna have to ask, I got a couple of relatives who are physicians. And my wife was a social worker who worked with high school students who were involved in all kinds of stuff. That's an interesting observation. Yeah, I mean, because if you can think of a mental disorder, somebody's probably argued that Holmes had it. It's kind of this little cottage industry that pick your favorite one. And, oh yeah, bipolar, that was popular for a while, that Holmes had bipolar, because he had these periods of depression and then these periods of sort of manic activity. So he is, maybe just a course in abnormal psychology should just work their way through the canon, and that would be a great final exam question.
For a thesis.
Or a thesis, that's right, yeah.
I don't remember the history all that well, but I think, didn't Arthur Conan Doyle try to kill off
He did.
Holmes?
He was not particularly enamored with Holmes, or his stories. I guess he at some point kind of considered him, popular schlock. He thought he was a much better novelist and even a poet. And I've read his poetry. He was a much better fiction writer, it turns out. And so, yeah, he does try to kill them all, and that's what happens at Reichenbach Falls, right? Holmes is dead, and Arthur Conan Doyle washes his hands of him. But the public outrage was so intense. It was an incredible that the Strand basically, had to capitulate and go pleading back to Arthur Conan Doyle to resurrect Holmes because people would not hear of it in terms of their favorite character dying. And it was like, I don't know. I guess, I would, the idea that my readers would be that passionate, and then I would say, no, I'm gonna write poetry. And, you know, I think there was little doubt that it was the Sherlock Holmes stories that, you know, put bread on the table. You know, it wasn't his novels, or he did some other short stories, and none of those had sort of the punch of it. And I think, you know, I really do think it was, you know, it just had all the right things. I think those qualities exist today, right? It's sort of the everyman, the flawed hero, right? The, you know, this complicated friendship. And I think all those, when I think about characters who I've written, the ones that I'm most pleased with, and maybe readers, have some of these same sorts of qualities and relationships. And I don't know, you know, I got into mystery writing thinking, I guess I should, you know, if you had to come up with percentages, right? That great mystery writing, what percentage is character, what percentage is plot, and what percentage is setting? Add that up to 100%, all right? What percentage is plot, what percentage is character, what percentage is setting? What would those percentages be for the best mystery writing?
Character 80%.
I think an okay plot with a brilliant character is just going to be so much better than a brilliant plot with paper thin characters. So, and I think, you know, and actually when you read some of the critics, you know, modern critics and critics of the 20th century of Holmesian novel and whatnot, they point out all of these plot flaws, right? That, you know, contradictions and inconsistencies, and how could he know this, and blah, blah, blah. And there are lots. I mean, it's like watching you know, these people who watch movies and find all the little problems in the movies, right? They just drive you crazy. But anyway, people do that with his works, and I'm pretty sure that his readers of the time were probably either didn't see them or didn't care. Because it was the character that they fell in love with, and so, you know, getting the character seems to be, so maybe like 80-15-5. Setting isn't worthless, but it's got to be character. Actually, I think good writing, setting is one of the characters, but or it can be. Other thoughts? Yeah.
So I'm just curious, what did you think of the Silk House?
I enjoyed it. I thought it was a solid.
I figured it out halfway through when he gave me the acronym. So once I figured it out, I kind of went, wait a minute. You know?
Well, yeah.
So I knew it was very well written, and I liked it.
Yeah, right. So what we would do is we would ding it for plot. Right.
It's a fun read.
Yeah, it's a fun read, right? But yeah, I mean, isn't that the plot challenge for us, right? To reach the conclusion, have the reader go, holy shit, I should have known that. Right?
Easy, right?
Yeah, that's right. I didn't, right? No way, and then, oh yeah. But if they get the oh yeah halfway through, then. Yeah.
What work are you talking about?
Silk House.
Silk House?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. And Silk is an acronym for something.
Yeah. Anything else? Did you knock off the brandy?
I think we should have a toast. We can have a toast for those that are left.
Oh, yeah.
I'll get it.
Well, here's to mystery writer, Rocky Mountain Mystery Writers of America. May our works last as long as that of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle.